It wasn't supposed to be anything special. A night out with friends, a chance to unwind. That's how I saw it anyway. But looking back, I realize how wrong I was. I guess I was fooling myself when I thought a simple party could be the escape from everything that had started to feel stagnant. James and I had been married for 5 years, and to be honest, I had started feeling more like his roommate than his wife. He's a good man, reliable, kind, even affectionate at times. But lately, there was a distance between us that was hard to ignore. Our conversations had become predictable, our evenings spent in front of the TV instead of in each other's arms. Our sex life, almost non-existent. It's not that I didn't love him, I did. But somewhere along the way, I realized we had fallen into a routine that felt more like a habit than a partnership. I tried not to think about it too much, because what could I do? We both had careers, busy lives, responsibilities, but sometimes I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. And that night, at that party, it was impossible to ignore. The house was buzzing with laughter and chatter as we arrived, the music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and there were people everywhere. The moment we stepped inside, I felt the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I had been looking forward to this night for weeks. It wasn't a huge party, just a few close friends from college. But it was exactly what I needed. James was already talking to some of the guys when we walked in, and I could tell that he was happy to catch up with his old friends. As usual, he was at ease, charming as ever. He kissed me on the cheek and disappeared into the crowd. I didn't mind. I wasn't really in the mood for small talk with his friends either. So, I grabbed a glass of wine and found a spot by the bar, where I could just enjoy the atmosphere without having to make conversation. That's when I saw him. John. I've known John for years. He's one of James' friends. But I've always noticed him in a way I never noticed the others. He was charming, undeniably attractive, and always just a little bit flirtatious, but never over the line. He'd always been friendly, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me feel noticed. Seen. It was different from the attention I got from James, who had grown used to me and, if I'm being honest, a bit indifferent. That night, though, John was different. He wasn't just being friendly. He was leaning in a little closer than usual, making jokes that bordered on teasing, complimenting me in a way that made my skin tingle. And the way he smiled at me. There was something in it that made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. I tried to brush it off. I mean, it was just harmless flirting, right? But with every laugh, every playful remark, I could feel myself leaning in closer, responding in ways I hadn't even realized. I didn't want to admit it to myself at first, but there was a part of me that liked it. I liked feeling desired. I liked the attention. And when I looked over at James, I saw him in deep conversation with some of the guys, laughing loudly, his back to me. He hadn't even noticed that I was talking to John. It was like I was invisible to him in that moment. "Hey, John said, leaning in closer. "I always knew you were a catch, but I think you're even more gorgeous than I remember." I tried to laugh it off, but the compliment hit me harder than I expected. There was a warmth in his words, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I had always been the nice wife, the dependable partner, but I hadn't felt truly seen in ages. "Thanks," I replied, a little flustered. "You're making me blush." John chuckled, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Well, you should blush more often. You've got this whole understated thing going on, but I bet you'd turn heads if you wanted to." I wasn't sure if he was just being playful, or if he meant it, but his words lingered in my mind. I looked at him for a second too long, and before I could even register it, a thought crossed my mind. A thought that was a little too bold. Maybe I should turn heads. I muttered under my breath, half to myself. John caught it. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low and teasing. I felt my heart race, a mix of excitement and guilt. I wasn't sure what I was saying, or where it was leading, but I felt like something was shifting inside me. Something I couldn't ignore. Then, just like that, I blurted it out, without thinking. "You know," I said, looking over at James, "I bet, if you really wanted to, you could pick me up and carry me to the bedroom. You could even carry me to his bed. What do you think?" The words were out before I could stop them. I hadn't meant it, of course. It was a joke. A stupid, meaningless joke. But as I said it, I felt an odd thrill. I looked over at James again, and there was something about the way he was talking to his friends, so oblivious to the world around him, that made me feel even more distant. I could tell he wasn't listening to me, that he didn't care about me the way he used to. And in that moment, it didn't matter anymore. It was just a joke. Just a silly comment. But John didn't laugh. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, his smile fading just a little. There was something almost predatory in the way he looked at me then. I froze, suddenly aware of how dangerous my words had been. "You don't really mean that, do you?" he asked quietly, his voice shifting, suddenly serious. For a split second, I felt a flicker of hesitation, but then I shrugged, trying to make light of it. "It's just a joke," I said quickly, taking another sip of wine. "You know, a little harmless fun. Just having a good time." But as I said it, I realized something. Maybe it wasn't just a joke. Maybe I wanted something more. Something that I hadn't been able to admit to myself until now. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside me. I had made a joke, sure, but I knew, deep down, that it was the beginning of something. And I didn't know if I was ready for it, but it was happening, whether I liked it or not. The party continued around me, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the image of John's face when I made that joke. It was almost as if he'd seen through the walls I'd built up around myself, the layers I had carefully placed to protect me from even considering the possibility of something more. I tried to convince myself that it was just the alcohol talking, that it was nothing, just a harmless flirtation, right? But every time I looked over at John, his eyes were locked on me, and that strange tension in the air grew thicker. It wasn't like I hadn't noticed John before. I'd always known he was attractive, tall, with dark hair and a smile that made him seem a little dangerous. But he'd always been a flirt, the kind of guy who could charm anyone without ever crossing a line. And up until that night, I had always brushed it off as just part of his personality. Nothing more. But tonight felt different. The way he looked at me, the way his hand brushed against mine when he passed me a drink. It was all deliberate. He wasn't just being friendly. I could feel the heat of his gaze from across the room, even when he wasn't speaking. It was as if he was waiting for me to do something. Something that I didn't even fully understand myself. I glanced at James again, who was still deep in conversation with some of the guys. He looked content, laughing about something, completely oblivious to the subtle tension between me and John. And that realization hit me like a jolt. He didn't even notice me anymore. Not in the way John noticed me. Not in the way I had hoped James would, back when we first got together. Suddenly, I felt so small, invisible, even. I grabbed another drink, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I wasn't a flirt, wasn't the kind of woman who would lead someone on. But there was something about the way John made me feel that made all my old reservations seem irrelevant. He was paying attention to me, noticing me. He wasn't ignoring me like James seemed to have done so often in recent months. I was starting to feel like I needed that attention. Like I had been starving for it, and now that it was in front of me, I couldn't look away. John said, appearing beside me again. He was standing a little too close, but I didn't step back. Instead, I looked at him, noticing how his eyes were slightly darker now, how his smile was more intense. "You've been awfully quiet. Are you sure you're okay?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just enjoying the night," I replied, a little too quickly. I didn't know what I was trying to cover up, my unease, or the fact that I was suddenly aware of how my heart was racing in response to his proximity. John gave a slight chuckle, his fingers brushing lightly over my arm. "If you ever need to get away from this crowd, I know a place where we can have some quiet. It's just down the hall." I froze for a second. His suggestion was innocent enough. Or at least, I tried to convince myself it was. But my mind was suddenly racing. What was he suggesting? What would happen if I followed him? Was this flirting, or was it something more? And yet, despite all the warning bells ringing in my head, I felt a thrill run through me. It was like something inside me had been awakened, and I couldn't push it away. The rational side of me knew this was dangerous, knew I was on the edge of something that could ruin everything, but that part of me was being drowned out by something far more reckless. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice was a little shaky. "I don't know, John. What's down the hall?" "Just a place to talk away from the noise," he said, his voice low and inviting. He didn't push, but his eyes held a challenge, like he was daring me to take the step. I looked over at James again. He was still engrossed in his conversation, laughing at something someone had said. His back was turned to me. He didn't even notice when I shifted my weight. when I stepped a little closer to John. I should have been angry. I should have felt some kind of guilt, something, anything, other than what I felt in that moment. But the truth was, I was tired of being invisible, of being the background character in my own life. I was craving attention, craving something exciting, something new. All right, I said, before I could stop myself, and immediately regretted it. John's smile widened. Thought you'd say that. He turned and led the way, and I followed, my heart beating faster with every step. I told myself it was just to talk. That nothing was going to happen, that I wasn't that kind of woman. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line, and I wasn't sure I could come back from it. The hallway was quiet, and I could still hear the muffled laughter and music coming from the main room, but it felt distant now. The air between John and me was thick, charged, like static before a storm. We reached a small sitting room, and he closed the door behind us. The room was dimly lit, with a few chairs scattered around, a couple of tables, and a single lamp casting shadows against the walls. John turned to me, his gaze holding mine. "Are you sure you want to be here, Em?" he asked, his voice low, almost serious. It wasn't a question anymore. It felt like an invitation. I should have said no. I should have turned around and walked back to James, but for some reason I didn't. Instead, I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Why not?" I said, my voice coming out a little too smooth, a little too confident. "We're just talking, right?" John stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. He didn't reply right away, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. And then, without warning, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear. "If you're sure, Em," he whispered. In that moment, I knew. I knew I was crossing a line that I could never uncross. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, a sound that felt too loud for the quiet room. John's breath was warm against my ear, and the distance between us seemed to shrink with each passing second. For a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world outside had vanished, leaving only the two of us in this small, dimly lit space. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away, told him that this was a mistake, that I didn't want this, not really. But the truth was, I was tired of feeling invisible, of being the woman who had everything but, somehow, nothing at all. James was a good man, a great man even. But lately, he had been more like a distant stranger than the man I had fallen in love with. He didn't notice when I was upset. He didn't see when I needed him. And here, with John, I felt something different, something alive. His attention felt like a spark, a jolt to my dull, routine life. And for the first time in so long, I felt desired. John whispered, his hand gently cupping my chin, tilting my face up to his. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to. But I can't stop thinking about how you look tonight, how beautiful you are." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, my breath coming faster, my body betraying me in a way I hadn't expected. He leaned in, and before I could second-guess myself, his lips were on mine. It was electric. For a split second, my mind tried to intervene, telling me to stop, to think about James, about what I was about to do. But the guilt was distant, and the pleasure of John's kiss was overwhelming. I kissed him back, just a little too eagerly, and everything in me screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't stop. John's hands were everywhere, his touch confident, urgent. And I responded. I wanted to respond. I wanted to feel something, to be seen, to have someone look at me the way I hadn't felt in so long. His lips moved down my neck, and I gasped. The heat in my body, the desire, the need that had been buried under the surface for so long, was suddenly so intense. My fingers found their way to his shirt, tugging at it, desperate to feel more of him. I could hear my breath hitching in my chest as he pushed me gently back onto the couch. This was happening. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear James laughing with his friends in the next room, completely unaware of what was happening just a few steps away. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was the one I had promised forever. And here I was, kissing another man, giving him my body, my desire, things I hadn't felt in so long with my husband. John's hands slid up my dress, and I froze, a brief moment of clarity cutting through the haze of lust. "Wait," I whispered, pushing at his chest, but he only grinned, leaning in to kiss me harder. "No waiting," he muttered against my lips, pulling me closer. I should have stopped him. I should have said something, done anything. But I didn't. I couldn't. And when his hands finally removed the last barrier between us, when he pulled me closer, and I felt him inside me for the first time, everything inside me exploded. I was lost in the moment, in the feeling of being wanted, being desired in a way I hadn't felt in forever. I couldn't even bring myself to think about what I was doing. It was like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me, detached, but too afraid to stop. The physical pleasure was overwhelming. Every part of me seemed to wake up, to come alive in a way I had forgotten. But in the back of my mind, the guilt started creeping in, slow and steady, as John moved with me, his hands on my skin, his voice whispering things that made my stomach turn. Afterwards, when it was over, I lay there next to him, my body still trembling with aftershocks. The room was quiet, save for our heavy breathing. I should have felt satisfied. But I didn't. Instead, I felt hollow. Empty. Like I had just betrayed everything I'd ever believed in. "What are you thinking about, Em?" John asked softly, his hand tracing lazy circles on my arm. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. The weight of what I had just done felt too heavy to even put into words. But eventually, I sighed, feeling the guilt gnaw at me with every second that passed. "I don't know," I said quietly. I don't know if I can ever go back." John didn't respond right away. His fingers paused on my skin. "You can't know what just happened," he said, almost as though it was a warning. "But I'm not going to ask you to choose, Em. I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be. But I won't lie to you either. I want this. I want you." I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I'm married," I whispered. "I'm not supposed to be here. I shouldn't have done this." John didn't answer. He just kissed my forehead, and in that moment, I felt the weight of my betrayal crash down on me. I had done it. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and even though my body was still warm from the intensity of what we had shared, all I could think about was what it would mean when I went back to James. What would happen when I had to face him? For the first time in a long time, I was afraid of the consequences, but it was too late to stop now. The moment I stood up, the heaviness of everything hit me all at once. I had done it. I had betrayed James in the most intimate way possible. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I even regretted it. Not in that moment. Not when the adrenaline was still rushing through me, and John's scent was still lingering on my skin. I dressed quickly, avoiding John's gaze as he lay back on the couch, his eyes closed, a satisfied smirk still playing on his lips. He didn't seem bothered by what had just happened. He wasn't the one who would have to go back to the life that felt like it was falling apart. "Do you want to stay?" he asked lazily, as if we'd just spent the evening watching a movie instead of that. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "I can't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned toward the door, fighting the wave of shame that had already started to crash over me. As I stepped into the hallway, I could hear the muffled sounds of the party still going on. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. But it felt so distant now. It felt like another world. The world where I had been me, the wife, the woman who loved her husband. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who had crossed a line she never thought she'd cross. The walk back to the main room seemed endless. I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, what I had just allowed to happen. What would I say to James? How could I even look him in the eye after what I'd done? I stepped into the living room, and there he was. James, still talking with his friends, a beer in his hand, completely oblivious to what had transpired just a few rooms away. His face lit up when he saw me, his lips curling into a warm smile. He had no idea. I tried to force a smile back, but I could feel the weight of the guilt pulling at me. "Hey?" I said, my voice shaky, more strained than I had intended. James raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Hey, you okay? You've been gone for a while." I nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just needed a little break, that's all." He didn't seem to notice anything unusual. His attention turned back to his conversation, and I stood there for a moment, feeling the sharp contrast between his carefree, happy demeanor and the turmoil swirling inside me. I had just ruined everything. As the evening wore on, I found myself retreating further and further into my own head. My smile felt forced. My laughter didn't reach my eyes. Every time I looked at James, the weight of what I had done pressed harder on my chest. The guilt, the shame, the fear, they all grew stronger. When the party finally started to wind down, James and I said our goodbyes to the hosts and made our way to the door. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. James wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close as we walked to the car. "I'm glad we came out tonight," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "We needed this, don't you think?" I nodded, but the lie felt hollow. The party hadn't made anything better. It had only highlighted how much was wrong, how much I had been trying to ignore. And now I had crossed a line I didn't know how to uncross. The drive home was silent. I couldn't bring myself to speak, and I was pretty sure James had no idea how much turmoil was raging inside me. The hum of the engine was the only sound between us, and I found myself watching the streetlights blur past, wishing that I could escape from my own thoughts. When we finally arrived home, James kissed me on the cheek, like he always did. "Good night, beautiful?" he said, his voice tender, and I could barely hold it together. I forced myself to smile, but it felt like a mask, and I hated myself for it. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up this act. I stepped into the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and stood in front of the mirror. The woman staring back at me was unfamiliar. Her eyes were tired, her face pale, and there was a look of guilt in her expression that I couldn't erase. I ran my fingers through my hair, my breath shallow and uneven. What had I done? I wanted to scream. I wanted to undo everything, to erase the night, to go back to before I even made that stupid joke. But I couldn't. The moment had passed, and there was no going back. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from John. "Had a good time tonight, Em. Don't forget about me." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. The words were casual, but there was an edge to them. John wasn't going to let me forget what had happened, and I wasn't sure I wanted him to. I quickly deleted the message, trying to push the thought of John out of my head. But it lingered. The feeling of his hands on me, the way he'd looked at me, the way I had felt alive in a way I hadn't in months, it was haunting, and I couldn't escape it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to gather myself, trying to piece together some semblance of who I used to be. But nothing felt right. Everything felt wrong. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, James was already in bed, waiting for me. I slid under the covers next to him, trying to pretend like everything was fine. But as I closed my eyes, all I could see was John. And I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. In the darkness, I whispered to myself, "What have I done?" But the answer, the truth of it, was something I didn't think I was ready to face.